It all started with an innocuous email. I received it late one Friday evening, as I lounged on my couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The subject line read, "You're invited to the adventure of a lifetime." The sender was someone named Arthur Grove. I didn't recognize the name, but curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I opened the email. Inside was a simple message. Congratulations. You've been chosen to participate in a private retreat at the historic Blackwood Manor, located deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. A select few individuals will gather for an exclusive weekend of relaxation, mystery, and discovery. All expenses paid. RSVP required. Beneath the text was a hyperlink to a fancy website showcasing pictures of the manor. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, towering spires, ivy-covered walls, and a thick forest surrounding the estate. There were glowing testimonials from past attendees, praising the experience as life-changing and unlike anything else. The skeptic in me screamed scam, but my mundane life begged for excitement. I was coming off a rough breakup, and the idea of escaping to a remote mansion intrigued me. After a quick search online confirmed Blackwood Manor was a real place, I took the plunge and hit RSVP. The following Monday, a black envelope arrived at my doorstep. Inside was a golden ticket embossed with the words, "Welcome to the Blackwood Experience." Alongside it were travel instructions and a note, "Pack light. Everything will be provided. A car will pick you up at 8 p.m. sharp on Friday." That week crawled by. My co-workers joked about me being the next victim of a true crime documentary, but I laughed it off. Deep down, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something unusual. By the time Friday arrived, I was oscillating between excitement and unease. As instructed, I stood by my apartment window, suitcase in hand, waiting for the promised car. At exactly 8 p.m., a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop outside my building. The driver, a middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face, stepped out and opened the door without saying a word. His crisp black uniform and polished shoes gave him the air of a chauffeur from an old movie. The back seat was plush, with dark leather seats that smelled faintly of lavender. I settled in for the ride, the hum of the engine lulling me into an uneasy calm. As the city lights faded into the distance, I tried making small talk with the driver. "So, how long is the drive?" I asked. He didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel with mechanical precision. "Have you driven other guests to the manor?" I ventured again. Nothing. Not even a glance in the rearview mirror. I leaned back, crossing my arms, trying to shake the growing tension in my chest. The only sound was the steady purr of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires as we turned onto increasingly narrow roads. The forest thickened as we climbed higher into the mountains. The trees stood like sentinels on either side of the road, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. Moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, and soon, we were enveloped in darkness. My phone lost signal somewhere around the third winding turn, leaving me completely cut off. Just as I began to question my decision, the forest opened up. A massive iron gate stood before us, flanked by weathered stone pillars. The intricate wrought iron swirled into unfamiliar patterns, almost like runes or ancient symbols. A chill ran down my spine as the gates creaked open of their own accord. Beyond them, Blackwood Manor rose out of the darkness. Its Gothic architecture was even more imposing in person. Stone gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their grotesque faces illuminated by faint moonlight. Ivy climbed the walls, clinging to the stone like veins. Candlelight flickered from a few windows, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move as we approached. The SUV rumbled up the gravel driveway and stopped in front of the grand entrance. The driver stepped out and opened my door. He handed me my suitcase and pointed toward the manor without uttering a word. Before I could thank him or ask any questions, he climbed back into the car and drove away, the red taillights vanishing into the trees. I turned to face the mansion. The massive double doors were made of dark wood, intricately carved with scenes I couldn't quite decipher in the dim light. Before I could knock, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a tall man in a dark suit. "I've been expecting you," he said. His voice was smooth and measured, with a faint accent I couldn't place. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." "I'm, here for the retreat," I stammered, my voice echoing in the cavernous entryway. "Of course," he said, bowing slightly. "I am Charles, the caretaker. Please, come in." As I stepped inside, the heavy door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous boom. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, wax, and something faintly metallic. The grand foyer was illuminated by a massive chandelier, its crystals casting fractured light across the walls. A spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into shadow, and arched doorways led deeper into the house. "Your room is ready," Charles said, taking my suitcase. "The others are already here. Dinner will be served shortly." "The others?" I asked, glancing around. The mansion seemed silent, almost lifeless. "Yes," he said, his thin lips curling into a faint smile. "You are not alone." As he led me through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The flickering candlelight played tricks on my eyes, and the portraits lining the walls seemed to follow me with their painted gazes. Each step I took echoed loudly, as though the house were amplifying the sound on purpose. Charles stopped in front of a heavy oak door and pushed it open. Inside was a lavishly furnished bedroom, complete with a four-poster bed, a crackling fireplace, and a single window overlooking the forest. The room was warm and inviting, yet something about it felt off. "Make yourself comfortable," Charles said, placing my suitcase near the bed. "Dinner is at 9 sharp. Do not be late." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flames in the fireplace. The silence of the manor pressed in on me, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. I told myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something about this place wasn't right. Dinner was announced by the toll of a deep, resonant bell that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. I checked the ornate clock above the fireplace. It was exactly 9. Remembering Charles's cryptic warning, I smoothed my clothes, took a deep breath, and headed down the dimly lit corridor toward the dining hall. The house seemed to breathe around me, every creak of the floorboards and sigh of the wind amplified in the heavy silence. As I approached the double doors at the end of the hallway, they swung open as if of their own accord, revealing the dining room bathed in golden candlelight. A long, polished table stretched across the center of the room, set with fine china, silverware, and crystal goblets. 4 people were already seated, their faces lit by the warm glow of the chandeliers. They looked up as I entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Charles stood at the head of the table, motioning for me to take the empty seat. "Ah, our final guest has arrived. Please, sit. Introductions are in order." I sat down and glanced around at the others. Directly across from me was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a severe black dress. Her steel-gray hair was tied in a bun, and she regarded me with piercing eyes that seemed to dissect every part of me. "I'm Evelyn," she said curtly. "Freelance journalist." Next to her sat a younger man, probably in his late 20s, with shaggy blonde hair and a nervous energy. He gave me a quick nod. "Derek," he said, "graphic designer. Nice to meet you." To my right was a man in his 40s, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth. His watch alone probably cost more than my rent for a year. "Paul," he said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Investment banker." Finally, to my left was a woman around my age, maybe a bit younger, with dark curly hair and an easy smile. "I'm Claire," she said. "I teach history at a high school. This place is, something, huh?" I introduced myself, feeling oddly self-conscious under their scrutiny. The conversations were polite but strained, as if everyone was sizing each other up. It didn't take long to notice that no one seemed to know what, exactly, this retreat was about. Like me, they had all received mysterious invitations and decided to take a chance. As the courses were served, rich, fragrant dishes that seemed almost too exquisite for a retreat like this, I began to relax. Charles hovered silently in the background, refilling glasses and clearing plates with an efficiency that bordered on uncanny. But there was something unsettling about him, the way he moved too smoothly, his shadow flickering oddly in the candlelight. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn spoke up. "Does anyone else find this whole thing strange?" she asked, her voice low. "No itinerary, no explanation, just come to this creepy house in the middle of nowhere." Paul chuckled, swirling the wine in his goblet. "Strange? Sure. But free. Let's not complain about a little mystery. It's probably some kind of team-building exercise. They'll make us do trust falls tomorrow." Claire shook her head. "It doesn't feel like that. This house," she paused, glancing around. "It's old. Really old. There's history here." "Not just history," Derek muttered, staring down at his plate. "Something else. Doesn't anyone else feel off? Like we're being watched?" The table fell silent. I hadn't realized it until he said it, but I'd felt the same thing, the prickling sensation of eyes on me, even when I was alone in my room. It was subtle, but constant, like a whisper you couldn't quite hear. Evelyn snorted. "Paranoia. That's all it is. Big house, weird atmosphere, it gets to you." But as the night wore on, even Evelyn seemed less sure. After dessert, Charles stood and announced that the evening would conclude with a guided tour of the manor. The others seemed hesitant, but curiosity won out. We followed him through the dimly lit halls, the air growing colder with every step. Charles led us to the library first, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with ancient tomes. "This is one of the manor's oldest features," he explained. "Some of these volumes are said to predate the house itself." Evelyn pulled a book from the shelf, its spine cracked with age. As she opened it, a strong gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. We froze, the darkness wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. "Power outage?" Derek whispered, his voice trembling. "Impossible," Charles said calmly, his silhouette just visible in the faint moonlight streaming through the high windows. "The manor does not rely on electricity." The candles reignited all at once, their flames flickering as if disturbed by an unseen breath. Evelyn quickly returned the book to the shelf, her hands shaking. "That's enough for tonight," Charles said, his tone sharper than before. "Please, retire to your rooms. Tomorrow will be illuminating." As we made our way back to our rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house seemed darker, heavier, as if the shadows themselves were alive. When I reached my room, I locked the door and bolted it for good measure. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the manor, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence. Just as I began to drift off, a soft knock at the door jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Summoning what little courage I had, I approached the door and pressed my ear against it. The hallway beyond was silent. Slowly, I unbolted the door and opened it a crack. No one was there. The corridor stretched out, empty and dark. But as I closed the door, I noticed something on the floor, a small scrap of paper folded into a neat square. I picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 3 words. Don't trust him. I stared at the note, my breath hitching. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. My mind raced. Don't trust him. Did it mean Charles? Or someone else? And who had slipped the note under my door? Before I could dwell on it, a sound echoed from the hallway, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the knock from earlier but something heavier, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The tapping grew louder, closer, then stopped just outside my door. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then came the sound of a low, guttural whisper, just barely audible through the thick wood. Leave. I stumbled back, heart pounding. Whatever was out there wasn't human. Summoning all my courage, I pressed my ear against the door, but the hallway had gone silent again. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the armchair by the fireplace, the note clutched in my hand. The shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edges of my vision, but I forced myself to stay awake. When morning finally arrived, a soft knock startled me. This one was gentle, polite, completely different from the knocks in the night. I opened the door cautiously to find Claire standing there, her face pale and drawn. "Did you hear anything last night?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I hesitated. Yes. Something strange. She nodded, biting her lip. "I think we need to talk. Meet me in the library after breakfast." Breakfast was a muted affair. The others looked as exhausted as I felt. Evelyn's sharp demeanor had softened, and Derek kept nervously glancing over his shoulder. Only Charles seemed unaffected, serving us with the same eerie calm as the night before. After breakfast, I slipped away to the library, where Claire was waiting. She'd pulled a stack of books onto a nearby table, their pages open to faded, crumbling texts. "Look at this," she said, her voice low. She slid one of the books toward me. The page showed an old woodcut illustration of the manor, but it was surrounded by strange symbols, similar to the ones on the iron gates. "What is this?" I asked. "Some kind of binding ritual," she said. "I couldn't sleep, so I came here to read. These books, they talk about Blackwood Manor like it's alive. There are accounts of people disappearing here, whole groups of them." "Disappearing?" My stomach turned. She nodded. "The house demands something. I don't know what, but it's like the people who come here are offerings." Before I could respond, the library door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside. His eyes landed on us, and for the first time, his polite smile faltered. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice still smooth but tinged with something colder. Claire quickly shut the book. "Fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just curious about the history of the place." Charles stared at her for a long moment, then at me. "History can be dangerous in the wrong hands," he said softly. "Do be careful." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. That afternoon, the 5 of us were summoned to the drawing room for what Charles called an activity to foster unity. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut. A circular table sat in the center, and on it was a strange board engraved with symbols. "A séance?" Evelyn scoffed, crossing her arms. "Really?" Charles inclined his head. "The manor has a long history of spiritual significance. It's tradition to commune with those who came before." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Reluctantly, we all took our seats around the table. Charles lit a single candle and placed it in the center, the flame casting long shadows across our faces. "Place your hands on the table," he instructed. I hesitated but followed the others, my palms resting on the cold wood. Charles began to chant softly, his voice rising and falling in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew heavy, charged, as if a storm were brewing inside the room. At first, nothing happened. Then, the candle flickered violently, and the temperature dropped. My breath came out in white puffs. The symbols on the board began to glow faintly, and a low hum filled the room. "Who are you?" Charles asked, his voice firm. The hum turned into a whisper, a dozen voices overlapping. The words were indistinct but filled with pain. The table trembled beneath my hands, and Derek yelped, pulling away. "Enough!" Evelyn snapped, standing up. "This is ridiculous." But before she could leave, the door slammed shut on its own. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, and the candle's flame shot up, almost reaching the ceiling. "Sit," Charles commanded, his eyes now glowing faintly. "It is not finished." Evelyn froze, her face pale. The rest of us sat paralyzed, unable to move as the whispers coalesced into a single, clear voice. "Choose." "What?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "One must stay," the voice said, echoing in the room. "The rest may leave." The temperature plummeted further, and the shadows around us seemed to close in. Derek began sobbing, clutching his head. "This is insane." Paul shouted, standing up. "We're not choosing anything." The shadows surged toward him, engulfing him in an instant. His scream was cut short, and when the darkness receded, he was gone. The room fell silent. Charles stood calmly, his hands folded in front of him. "The house has made its decision," he said. "You may all leave." But none of us moved. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on us, suffocating. By the time we left Blackwood Manor, the sun was setting. The driverless SUV that brought us was waiting, its engine idling. We climbed in, too dazed and terrified to speak. As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the house. In the highest window, I saw Charles watching us, his glowing eyes the last thing I remembered before the manor disappeared behind the trees. The note I'd found still burned in my pocket. "Don't trust him." I never found out who had written it. And I never went back.